Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. Delighted today to be joined by Craig and Chris from Score. We're going to be talking about breathing life into your processes. The guys are going to give us an overview of the solution and the areas that they're trying to disrupt, and then we'll have a conversation about all things process documentation mapping related. Hi Craig, hi Chris, how you doing? So Craig, we'll start with you. You're the CEO at Score. Again, be good for maybe those that aren't familiar with yourself. We'll talk about the product in a while. It's for you to give us a bit of a career biog, what you've done, how you landed where you are today.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and be as succinct as possible. It's had quite a varied career, but I started my career in technology, actually in hardware, and then quickly moved on to internet technologies. But I learned very early on in my career that it doesn't matter how good piece of technology is, if you can't get people to buy into the vision of that technology or to understand how it works, then it's not going to be successful. So relatively early in my career, I actually moved into areas around change management and understanding business processes. A large part of my career, I would have said that I've been a business process improvement or business process management consultant, but that's been mainly on technology driven change and transformation projects. I've been lucky enough to work with organizations of all sizes, from small startups right through to large enterprises, and went through a number of years traveling the globe extensively, which was fun at the time, but it meant I spent a lot of time away from the family. But as I said, the real driving factor behind my career has always been about how do I marry up technology with the needs and wants of everyday people and make sure that they're getting the most out of that technology.
Brilliant. And Chris, quick career history from you?
Yes, so the abbreviated version. I actually trained as a scientist at university in physics. Managed to get into the telecoms industry just before it went pop. But while I was pretending to be a scientist in a lab, I was paying more attention to what the IT guys were doing and the system guys were doing. So that really sort of spurred an interest in going back to university, doing a master's in information systems. So I was fascinated about how people interacted with technology and change and projects and processes. So I was lucky enough to get involved in a smallish, growing UK-based company, which took me to all sorts of places, working for the likes of Nestle, Sony, BAE, on big projects like ERP projects or organizational redesign or operational improvement, but all based around common theme of process, which obviously feeds nicely into Score and taking that forward.
Yeah, so process is a big part of what you do in terms of, we'll find out a bit more about the product from Craig in a second, and clearly process is a big part of what we measure. So a nice, happy marriage there in terms of how we work together. So Craig, tell us about the solution. Tell us about how you're trying to disrupt typical ways of visualizing process.
Yeah, going back to what I said in my sort of bio there, we spent many years, and by the way, the founding team of Score, we've worked together for nigh on 15 years, so long before we started Score. We worked with a lot of these well-known household brands, as I was saying, all over the world. And working in terms of trying to understand the structure of these organizations and make them as efficient and as effective as possible. And if you go back 15 years or even longer, those big change programs were always driven by, or largely driven by, technology, but also they were the preserve of the IT department. And and that while that's not always the case today, what is true today, as it was then, is that the tools and techniques that were available to us as consultants in terms of understanding how processes work, understanding the architecture of an organization, they were the preserve of the enterprise. They required expensive, high-end, complicated tools with highly skilled members of staff to run them. And one of the trends that we've seen, over the last couple of decades in this sort of shift to cloud computing means that the ability for almost anyone within an organization and any size of organization, right? So not just the larger enterprises, but even small to medium-sized businesses. It means that people can get and switch technology on quicker than they could ever do before. And that makes that provides a huge amount of benefit, but it also makes things quite complex for people. And so it became quite obvious that you needed to make some of these tools that we used as consultants to make sense of complexity, to make them much easier and more available to a much wider audience. And we've talked a lot about process, and that's been our area of focus, if you like. How do we take something as simple as process modeling and flow charting and make it easier and quicker for people to be able to pick up and use? So I don't want to say that we're disrupting consulting, for example, because we have a huge number of our users are consultants, but we certainly make that type of work much quicker and much easier to do than it traditionally was. But we also see a lot of organizations adopt SCORE to use it to do process improvement, process management work themselves, where previously they might have had to rely more heavily on outside help. So that's really what we're doing, is making these tools much more accessible so that people can pick them up and run with it themselves.
And does that then lead to more of a shift in how people interact with the solution? So my view or my experience is that people will spend a lot of time documenting processes in various guises, online, offline, paper, whatever, but then that's it. So with it becoming easier to document and design the processes and change the processes, surely that means now there should be more of a living and breathing thing. So as the process evolves, it's easier to update it. Is my thinking right there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, partly there's a bit of a behavioural challenge here, right? That in so many organisations, we're used to that cycle of big project coming up, bunch of discovery work, create reams and reams of documentation that no one ever uses again. But that happens partly because it is hard work, right? It takes time. The tools aren't super intuitive to use, that you need to do it. And that's one of the things that we're trying to fix. And so it means that it is easier to go back and visit documentation and keep it up to date and so on. But also, it's not just the tools, but the approach you take, right? We've been really focused on keeping the approach simple so that anyone, like literally anyone, you don't need to be an analyst or any sort of technology expert to be able to pick up and read a process. And so it should be much easier for you to be able to keep that alive, keep it updated. And that's certainly the behavior we're seeing in more and more organizations we work with, that once they've created it, they've created a valuable asset. Why let it sit in a cupboard somewhere gathering dust or digital dust on a server somewhere?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And Chris, from your point, does that bring the owner of the process closer to the operation because it's easier to share and visualize and discuss with the people doing that process?
Indeed, it does. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you think about who the owner should be in a process, there's no one clear answer. But our experience, our strong advice would be it's got to be that person that's going to be able to affect the change. There's no point someone owning a process and they don't really drive the change. They don't really understand what's going on. So putting that person who can affect that change and then keeping the process as easy to understand by anyone that's going to have a part to play is critical. That's what really our one bit of advice. Keep it easy to understand and keep it owned by a person that can affect that change.
And by the nature of it, it must mean that you don't lock yourself into, as Craig talked about in the earlier part, those, I suppose, documentation experts, let's call them, that are the only ones that can use the tool, the only ones that can update the tool or make changes. Now, clearly there has to be a process flow of who can and can't update, but actually, I mean, I've used it, so I can document a process, so it must be fairly foolproof if I can get through one. But that opens up a whole other world of collaboration around processes, I assume, Chris?
Indeed, it does. I mean, if we flip it on its head, what's the norm? If you're before SCORE, or still prevalent in probably more organisations than not, it's these individuals that own that discovery, that process discovery phase. They own that tool set. I'm not going to call out any tools in this discussion, but we can probably all know who they are. But they're very expensive tool sets. They take time to learn. It's a special skill set, and those individuals within the organisation, especially the larger organisations, are in demand because of that, because they're a finite resource and probably supporting quite a few projects. So we've seen it time and time again where a project requires process work. They'll put the request into the central process team. They'll get a slot in a few weeks' time. They come down to the desk or facilitate a workshop. And then a few weeks later, they'll get a printout of their version of the process. And that's really just not conducive to any kind of change, especially as Craig mentioned in his in the introductory talk. You can't spend months and months documenting processes, or even weeks documenting processes, when the technology that you're implementing to support that process is going to be up and running in half that time. It's just not there. So you need to give your BAs, your process owners, your teams superpowers when it comes to documenting those processes.
And you guys are at a stage now where you can pretty much map a process, document a process, whatever terminology you want to use, in a workshop on the fly. So Craig, might be helpful if you can kind of talk us through how that would work.
Yeah, this was actually one of the first things we focused, or it was the first thing we focused on with the product. I've been involved in so many workshops over the years, and you know, some of them are really successful. You get really energized group of people who really, in some respects, a process workshop can be incredibly therapeutic for the participants to really get a lot of this information out onto the table. Some of the challenges, you know, when they realize that their colleagues are facing the same challenges, when they share their ideas about how to improve the process. But at the same time, you've been involved in workshops that just didn't go that well, and you know, people will leave the room going, well, that was a waste of my time, not sure what the point of this exercise is, and so on. And we were really trying to work out how do we bottle up that brilliant experience and make it much easier to do. And we looked at an approach that made it easier to engage with people, to get people on board, and being very sort of open. One of the things we found challenging was some of the older or more traditional approaches to flow charting. Some of the standards that are available now are not always conducive to engaging non-technical people. So we looked around, we found an approach that worked really well, but then we had to build a product that was intuitive enough and quick enough so that you could, first of all, map at the speed of conversation. So you need to be in a workshop environment. You need to be able to put it up on the screen as quick as people tell you. Otherwise, the tool becomes a barrier. But the second thing is that we really focused on, thought about a lot, was if everyone's sitting in a room looking at a screen, right, that initially suggested it's not as interactive as if you're all standing around a whiteboard shuffling sticky notes around. And so we thought a lot about the structure of the approach, and how do you get people into the flow of talking about it and take away all the friction. So as I said, it's partly the approach that's nice and structured. It asks people questions as they go, and then building an intuitive interface, which means that the user, we've built things like shortcuts into the product so that you can literally facilitate and map a process at the same time. And that's essentially the core of it.
And that must really help in the year we've lived in terms of collaborating online and virtual collaboration post meetings, so that without knowing, it's almost set up for the current environment.
Yeah, exactly. This is something we've been doing for a number of years, helping people run remote process discovery and remote process workshop sessions. But yeah, as soon as the lockdown was on the cards, it became obvious that this was a tool that was going to really help people. And we saw that certainly in the early days. We saw a huge amount of demand for people to do this sort of work after the initial shock, but also training. We saw a huge amount of interest in just kind of learning the basics of the approach and the tool so that people could get up and running and start using it, so they could make this sort of smooth transition from the traditional face-to-face workshops they'd been doing pre-lockdown to essentially carry on the projects that they were delivering. And interestingly, I spoke to a consulting company we worked with yesterday down in South Africa, and they were saying that they would always been skeptical about doing anything online before the pandemic hit, and actually since March they've delivered several projects where they've never met the client. Like, they've never been in the same room as the client. They met them online, delivered all the work online, and delivered the project.
Yeah, it's amazing how we've grown into that, and I think normal, or the new normal's been words that have been overused massively this year. But maybe that's the reset, that now you don't need to. It is nice to meet people. It's always nice to interact face to face. But in a world that thinks differently, maybe that's the way that is the new normal, to coin a phrase that's been overused. So, Chris, one of the new things that you guys have been working on, I know it's been in the product for a while, but there's been a series of updates, is the whole Quantify piece. Be good to share what that does and your kind of hopes and future pieces around that part, because that really sets you guys apart and stands out.
Yeah, indeed. No, I mean, it's all built on the core score idea of building out a process, understanding what that process is, and then what you can do with the Quantify module is very simply, against each step, just add some quantification data. So how long is it taking? What's the volume going through it? Are there any fixed costs and the like? And then being able to then, because in the score methodology, you're putting roles and resources against each activity, putting a cost against those. So very quickly, without the need for spreadsheets, I hasten to add, you're getting a picture of your process in terms of how long is it taking, where are the bottlenecks in terms of time or cost. And what we've done in the last few months is really beef up that functionality to include things like FTE analysis. So putting in the people that you think you've got to support that, and then looking and being able to run scenarios around the throughput. It's amazing. It really is a good piece of functionality, and it's letting businesses ask questions and get rapid answers. Like, if we were to double our business next month, what sort of team would we need to look at? Do we need to re-skill people? Do we need to onboard people? Do we have too many people in a team? And of course, a lot of those questions were driven from the likes of lockdown and furlough, because business was lumpy, teams coming back in at different times, who to bring back. And Score combined with that module starts to allow businesses to plan for that growth again, with confidence.
And Craig, without giving away anything that's too secret, can you share any of the stuff you're thinking about in terms of the future of the product and where it's heading?
Yeah, we're always thinking about lots of different new and exciting things, but we also have to constantly remind ourselves about what's the core value of Score, right? And the core value, and as many of our users like to remind us, is it's about that simplicity, that ease of use, the speed with which you can get things done, and the way that I'll use the term end users, i.e. the people in the process, the people who are often being impacted by the change, the way that they can engage with it. So we always have to keep those sorts of things in mind when we're looking at the future. But again, whatever we can do to make life easier for people, and I'll touch on something that we have launched that's quite new, but we'll certainly be developing more in the near future. And it's the ability to link Score in with tool, sort of task management or project management type tools, because it's brilliant for doing the discovery work, and out of that discovery work you find all sorts of things that need to be done in a project or program. And so making it much easier and giving much more visibility to teams about what those tasks are and where they relate to within a process. Some of the areas we've been experimenting with be around digital transformation, where there's some sort of technology or system that needs to be developed or configured or improved. And we've been looking at, you map the process, and then against individual steps in the process, you can define things like user stories and success criteria and other types of implementation criteria you need to know, and then send that to a product like Microsoft Azure DevOps, one of those types of task management tools. And therefore you have this sort of complete picture, because you've got the sort of business view of how the process works in Score, which is then directly linked to how the implementation team are consuming that information in their task management. And that team can then kind of link back and see, okay, you think a developer going, right, I've been asked to implement this particular feature, but why? Why do I need it? Because there's different ways I can do it. What's the context? So from DevOps, they can click a link and they can go straight back to the model and they can see the context in which that exists. And so while it's very early days, we've had some really interesting feedback on that. And that's certainly one of the areas that, that we'll be looking to improve and develop. And I think another major piece that we're looking at is around our user interface. So we've had an external agency in running a series of user experience research and experiments on the product. We've had some great feedback, and we're working towards implementing some of those. So again, all following those themes of ease of use, simplicity, making it as accessible as possible. We'll be continuing into the new year.
Good to hear. Exciting times then. Exciting times. So if people want to find out more about you guys, more about the products, Chris, where's the best place for people to find you?
If you go to gitscore.com, our website, you'll find a wealth of information there with signposts off to things like our YouTube channel. We've got a growing and thriving community where you can dip your toes in there if you want to have a look and see sort of some of the conversations going off on there. And we're always running webinars and the like. So best thing to do, go to our website, subscribe to our newsletter and have a dig around. And if you're interested in a conversation, then we're more than happy to pick that up.
And both of you guys, so it's Craig Willis and Chris Green, are on LinkedIn, so people can connect in with you there if they're on that platform as well.
Please do. We love to have a good bit of engagement over LinkedIn and some good conversations. So please do connect.
Good. So guys, it's been a fascinating chat. I'll finish with the final podcast question. So let's start with you, Chris. What's the best bit of business advice you've ever been given?
Oh, crikey. I didn't see that one coming.
That's the point.
Yeah, that's good. Best bit of business advice, I think just get started. I think that's something I've learned, especially since being co-founder of Score. You can spend ages and ages procrastinating about planning perfectly, creating a perfect plan, figuring out all the scenarios when in fact you've missed the point. Actually get started, try something, see if it works and evolve from that.
No, I like that. And you tend to learn a lot of stuff by getting started that you probably never thought about in 6 months of thinking and planning.
Indeed, and be prepared to fail, because there's probably going to be more that doesn't work than does work in the totality of things. So just crack on.
Good. And Craig, you've had a bit more time to think about it, so we're expecting a good one.
I was so hoping you were going to ask me the same question.
I am. No, same question.
Brilliant. The one that immediately popped into my mind as soon as I heard the question was a few years ago. I worked with a CIO from a major retailer, household brand certainly in the UK, and I think in other countries too. And he made this point. He said, "Look, I'm a very, very busy person. If you want to get my attention and get me to make a decision, you need to tell me what the answer is in one sentence, and then back it up with other information." And essentially, what he was saying there was, whether you're in a sales environment or trying to get an idea across to people, it's dumb it right down to the very, very simplest term. And actually, keeping things simple is harder to do than you think it is. But if you can keep that in mind, how do you keep the message as simple as possible? I think that's something that we strive to do, as difficult as it can be.
Brilliant. No, I love those. Guys, as I said, absolute pleasure to give everybody an update on the product. And for those that didn't know about it, a bit of education. Look after yourselves and we'll speak soon.
Brilliant. Thank you.